All right, joined now by NCAA President Charlie Baker, and Charlie in town for a very special occasion on this Tuesday as you got a chance to be part of the first ever congressional engagement listening session in the history of this country. And why was this an opportunity you wanted to be a part of?
Well, first of all, it was a great chance to be with some terrific schools that do great work on behalf of the student athletes and the students generally that they serve. And I also thought it was a unique opportunity to be part of this conversation with Senator Thune. Senator Thune is a voice in Washington that matters, and he's been somebody who's been interested in these issues around student athletes and the future of both college sports generally and NIL in particular. And I think having the opportunity to have this conversation, especially with a group of D2 and D3 schools. My kids played D3. I have a ton of friends whose kids played D3. I'm very familiar with what D3 and D2 are all about. They don't get all the attention that some of the high-powered D1 schools get, but at the end of the day, they actually serve more student athletes than a lot of the schools people are most familiar with, and I think that's an important part of the conversation.
Well, you've been on the job since March. It's a shame that you came into this thing without anything to talk about, right off the start. Yeah. Just some very hot button issues involved, and you mentioned a couple of them at length here today, and in particularly NIL and the transfer portal. Let's start with the NIL. This is obviously a discussion that is drawing everybody's attention. There's an awful lot of money being thrown around, and there's a lot of concerns because of that. So what is the best practice going forward in terms of handling that and maybe establishing some sort of regulation with how it's approached?
Well, I think the big challenge with NIL is not the concept. I mean, I think everybody agrees that student athletes should be able to benefit from their name, image, and likeness. The problem with it right now is there's no visibility into accountability or transparency for much of any of the players in the system. And therefore, everybody's relying on hearsay and misinformation and rumor to try to make the best decision for them and for their family. And I've talked to a lot of student athletes who said to me, look, I don't know who's repping me. I don't know how my best interests are being represented here. I don't know. I can't figure out what a deal that involves somebody with my background, my skill set, my station would make sense. And I think what we want more than anything going forward is a more transparent and accountable system. You know, agents should have to register the same way they do in every other industry where somebody's brokering a financial transaction. I mean, I've talked to athletic directors and I've talked to student athletes who told me stories about NIL deals that have been done where the agent makes way more than the student. It shouldn't work that way. I've talked to a lot of folks who've told me about deals in which student athletes are signing deals that go way beyond their experience as a student athlete, thereby tied up with an agent way past their academic career, which doesn't make any sense. So there should be a uniform contract that basically says, you know, it's 4 years unless you get permission from the student athlete for more than 4 years. Here's what the traditional agency fee should look like. If you want more than that, you need to talk to the student athlete about it and get their permission. There should be some sort of registry around the deal to get done so people have some idea about what a deal really does look like. And the other reason this stuff matters, and you brought up the transfer portal, last year almost half the kids in D1 who entered the transfer portal thinking they had an opportunity somewhere else because somebody told them there might be one, lost their scholarship at the school they were at and ended up nowhere. And you would expect that some kids would test the portal just as a matter of course, and there might be a few that would end up not landing anywhere. But when you have literally almost half the kids who go into the portal landing nowhere, what that says to me is there's an incredible amount of misinformation out there. There's a lot of pulling kids into the portal. Like we've talked to some of them who got pulled into the portal based on a promise, as Senator Thune said. But there was no promise. It was just it was somebody collecting names to see who they might be able to pitch to somebody on the other end. And that's not good for student athletes, and it's not good for NIL, and it's not good for the state of college sports.
Is this a conversation mostly or just for the NCAA, or do you see an avenue to get congressional involvement here? And is it important to find a way to work together on this particular issue because there is so much involved for so many people?
Well, I guess I'd say two things. One is there are certain things the NCAA should do on our own end. You know, we as a membership organization should be able to deal with some of the issues around transparency, around agent certification, around the nature of what a uniform standard contract might look like. But it's very hard for us to deal with something like 50 states doing 50 different things around how NIL rules work in their states, especially when most of the conferences involve multiple states. You have a state that has, if you have a conference that's in 5 states, and all 5 states have completely different rules around NIL, that's not a very competitive playing field for all the folks that are involved. One of the things the feds can do is they can preempt all the state laws and say there's going to be one framework and one framework only with respect to how this works. And I think you'd find that most student athletes, most coaches, most schools would say that would be preferable to this constant race to the bottom, which is what's going on now.
The other major topic that's been around for a while but has been particularly prevalent in the news here lately has been conference realignment. And as you consider a state like South Dakota with mid-major schools, what's the how do you protect the mid-major level and prevent them from being kind of left in the dust when all this continues to happen?
Yeah, I mean, on some level, I would say realignment is, most people, a lot of people have written stories about realignment, and they all basically say the same thing, which is this was about TV revenue, media rights, and the benefits, obviously, for the schools that are involved in this are significant. Several of the college presidents basically said they didn't want to do it. I felt like I had to because of the money that was involved. I really hope everybody figures out a way to make sure that if in fact they did it because they thought they had to, that they make sure that the student athletes who now may be playing on a much bigger playing field geographically don't lose their ability to be student athletes because of that decision. The second thing I would say is I think for a lot of the folks, though, in the rest of D1 and most of D2 and D3, as long as we get some of this other stuff right, I think they'll be okay. They're not going to have to deal with the kind of turmoil that's created by some of these media right deals, which are definitely a double-edged sword when it comes to these issues.
As you look at everything, and you've kind of got to be a big picture guy as the president of the NCAA, and all these different things that you're trying to manage all at once, is the current model of the NCAA sustainable with all of these major things happening all at the same time?
I guess my answer to that would be, if you leave it exactly the way it is, probably not. But the great thing about a challenge is it's an opportunity. And I think from our point of view, some of the stuff we've done already around making sure that there's 2 years of injury insurance protection for kids across all 3 divisions if they get hurt playing their sport and they need to continue to have treatment after they're done with their eligibility or they graduate, just did that. Starts next year. The D1 rules around scholarship protection and the opportunity to graduate after your eligibility expires and access to certain services. Again, those things all start next year as well. I think the thing we have to do is to accept the fact that the times are changing, and whether it's NIL or student athlete supports around mental health or supports around scholarship protection, whatever it might be, or the way the organization is structured and how D1 and D2 and D3 work. We need to be up for the challenge that says you can't sit back on your heels and just expect to do the same thing tomorrow that you did yesterday. We need to continue to anticipate where the future's going and make changes to accommodate student athletes and the schools they participate in going forward. And if we don't do that, we're not serving the folks we should be looking after and taking care of.
Well, all difficult conversations. Certainly appreciate you taking the time to hear today to spend with us and having this dialogue to the public, open to the public, and appreciate you certainly taking a few minutes while you're here with us and sharing your thoughts.
Happy to do it. Thanks very much.